Eleanor Washington, a 8-year-old black retired professor, stood surrounded by airport security at JFK, handcuffed with her passport confiscated. Her desperate pleas fell on deaf ears as she was publicly accused of fraud. Then a tall white man approached, and the security guard's face transformed from smug certainty to shock as the man revealed his identity. Before I continue this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more stories about everyday injustice and the moments when the tables finally turn. Now let's dive deeper into what happened to Eleanor before that fateful moment. Eleanor Washington had been looking forward to this day for months. After dedicating 40 years of her life to education and humanitarian work, she was finally receiving the recognition she deserved. The Geneva International Humanitarian Committee had selected her to receive their prestigious Lifetime Achievement Award for her groundbreaking programs bringing education to refugee communities across 3 continents. The morning of her departure, sunlight streamed through the windows of her Minneapolis home as Eleanor carefully folded her acceptance speech and placed it in her leather portfolio. Her hand, slightly wrinkled but still elegant with neatly manicured nails, moved with precision born from decades of thoughtful work. "Mom, are you sure you don't want me to come with you?" Terrence asked, leaning against the doorframe of her bedroom. At 42, he still looked at his mother with the protective concern of a child who knew her worth better than the world did. Eleanor smiled, tucking a silver lock of hair behind her ear. "I've been traveling alone since before you were born, Terrence. I'll be just fine." I know. It's just..." Terrence hesitated, his expression clouding. "You know how these airports can be sometimes." Eleanor paused her packing, turning to face her son fully. They both knew what he meant. Throughout her academic career and humanitarian work, Eleanor had endured her share of random security screenings, invasive questioning, and suspicious glances. But she had always faced them with dignity. "If I could reschedule this client meeting, you know I would." Terrence continued, guilt shadowing his features. "And have you missed closing the biggest contract of your career? Absolutely not." Eleanor zipped her suitcase with finality. "Besides, this isn't my first rodeo." Just then, Eleanor's phone rang. It was Aisha, Terrence's wife. "Eleanor, just checking if you've got everything ready." Aisha's warm voice came through the speaker. "All set, dear. Just finished packing. I've put a little surprise in the front pocket of your carry-on." "Don't peek until you're on the plane," Aisha instructed. "And remember, you can call us anytime." "You two worry too much," Eleanor laughed, though secretly she appreciated their concern. After Terrence left for his meeting, Eleanor sat at her vanity, applying her signature coral lipstick. The face looking back at her from the mirror had aged gracefully. Deep brown skin with laugh lines that mapped a life well lived. Intelligent eyes that had seen both hardship and beauty. She had survived the civil rights era broken barriers as one of the first black women to receive tenure at her university, raised a son on her own after her husband's early death, and built educational programs in countries where girls had never been allowed to learn. A simple airplane trip to Geneva was nothing compared to what she had already conquered. Eleanor triple-checked her documents. Passport. With diplomatic visa. Courtesy of the UN Committee invitation letter, conference details, and identification. Everything was in perfect order, as she knew it would be. She had learned early in life that as a black woman she needed to be twice as prepared and leave no room for error. The cab ride to Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport was uneventful. The driver, a Somali man named Abdi, brightened when she mentioned her humanitarian work. "My sister was able to learn reading in one of those refugee programs in Kenya," he told her. "Maybe it was yours." Eleanor smiled. "It very well might have been. We started in Kenya in 1998. "Then I must thank you," Abdi said, meeting her eyes in the rearview mirror. "She is a doctor in Stockholm now." These were the moments that made her decades of work worthwhile. The Minneapolis airport was relatively smooth, though not without the usual subtle indignities. The security agent barely looked at her as he checked her ID, speaking to her in the slow, loud voice often reserved for those assumed to be foreign or unintelligent. At the security checkpoint, she was randomly selected for additional screening while younger white travelers sailed through. Eleanor didn't complain. She never did. She simply stood with her practiced patience as they swabbed her hands for explosive residue and searched through her meticulously packed bag. Her first flight from Minneapolis to JFK was smooth, and Eleanor used the time to review her acceptance speech. The words were a testament to her life's work, emphasizing that education wasn't charity, it was justice, a fundamental right that knew no borders. As the plane began its descent into New York, Eleanor gazed out the window at the sprawling metropolis below. JFK would just be a brief layover before her international flight to Geneva. In less than 24 hours, she would be standing before the international humanitarian community, finally receiving acknowledgement for decades of work often done in obscurity. She felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. Despite her extensive travel experience, this journey was special. This wasn't just a trip, it was a victory lap, a moment of vindication for all the times she'd been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. The plane touched down at JFK International Airport, and Eleanor gathered her belongings, unaware that her moment of triumph was about to be derailed in ways she couldn't imagine. As she stepped into the bustling international terminal, she held her head high, a lifetime educator and humanitarian making her way to receive her flowers at last. Little did she know that the greatest test of her dignity was waiting just beyond passport control. The international terminal at JFK hummed with activity as Eleanor joined the line for passport control. All around her, travelers from across the globe chatted excitedly in various languages. Business people tapped on laptops and families corralled energetic children. Eleanor stood calmly in line, her posture perfect, as always, passport and boarding pass ready in her hand. When her turn came, she approached the counter with a polite smile. The agent, a white man in his 40s with Richard Hayes on his name tag, barely glanced at her as she slid her documents across the counter. "Purpose of your connecting travel?" he asked, flatly, still not meeting her eyes. "I'm attending a humanitarian conference in Geneva," Eleanor replied. "I'm receiving an award from the International Humanitarian Committee." Something in her response made Agent Hayes look up his brow, furrowing slightly as he examined her face, then returned to her passport with newfound scrutiny. His eyes lingered on her diplomatic visa page. "This is a diplomatic visa," he stated, an edge of suspicion creeping into his voice. "Yes, the committee arranged it since I'm receiving their Lifetime Achievement Award and will be meeting with several UN officials," Eleanor explained. Hayes's expression hardened. "Ma'am, do you work for the US government?" "No, I'm a retired professor. The diplomatic visa was arranged by the UN committee hosting the event." Hayes studied her passport again, flipping through the pages with increasing deliberation. The line behind Eleanor grew, but he seemed unconcerned with the delay he was causing. "Wait here," he instructed, taking her passport and walking to a desk at the back of the area where he spoke in hushed tones with another agent. Eleanor maintained her composure, though anxiety began to rise in her chest. Around her, other travelers were being processed quickly. A young white couple who had been behind her in line were already collecting their stamped passports from another agent. After several minutes, Hayes returned with a supervisor, a broad-shouldered white man whose name tag read Bradley Thompson. "Ma'am, would you please step over to secondary screening?" Thompson asked, though his tone made it clear this wasn't a request. "Is there a problem with my documentation?" Eleanor asked calmly. "We just need to verify a few things," Thompson replied vaguely. "Please come with us." Conscious of the stares from other travelers, Eleanor followed the two men to a separate area. Her heart pounded, but her face remained composed, a skill perfected over decades of being the only black woman in countless rooms. In the secondary screening area, Thompson began questioning her, while Hayes observed, "You stated you have a diplomatic visa for Switzerland. Can you explain how you obtained this?" Eleanor took a slow, steadying breath. As I explained to Agent Hayes, I'm receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Humanitarian Committee in Geneva. They arranged the visa through proper channels because I'll be meeting with UN officials during my visit. And you have documentation of this invitation, Thompson asked. Yes, of course. Eleanor reached for her carry-on, retrieving a folder with her invitation letter, conference schedule, and hotel reservations. She handed them to Thompson, who examined them with obvious skepticism. These could easily be fabricated, he muttered to Hayes, though loud enough for Eleanor to hear. Eleanor felt a flash of indignation. Those are official documents from an internationally recognized organization. You can verify them with a simple phone call. Thompson ignored her suggestion. What exactly is this award for? I've spent 40 years developing educational programs for refugee communities worldwide. My work has helped establish schools in 27 countries and provided education to over 50,000 children who would otherwise have had no access to learning. Hayes scoffed quietly, exchanging a glance with Thompson that made Eleanor's stomach tighten. Ma'am, diplomatic visas are typically reserved for government officials or those directly working with international organizations, Thompson stated. Not retired teachers. I'm a professor emeritus of international education with 3 honorary doctorates. Eleanor corrected him, struggling to keep her voice even. And as I've explained, the visa was arranged properly through the Humanitarian Committee. More agents had gathered nearby, occasionally glancing in their direction. Eleanor noticed one of them, a young black woman watching with poorly concealed concern. I need to make my connecting flight to Geneva, Eleanor said, checking her watch. If you could please verify my documentation and return my passport, I'd appreciate it. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to surrender your phone, Thompson said instead. My phone. Why? Standard protocol for security concerns. Eleanor's heart raced faster. I need to call my son. He should know if there's a problem with my travel. You can call after we've completed our investigation, Hayes interjected. With reluctance, Eleanor handed over her phone, feeling increasingly vulnerable. Thompson took it and placed it in a plastic bin along with her passport. Now, if you'll come with us, we need to conduct a more thorough examination of your belongings. As they led her to a small room away from the main terminal, Eleanor noticed travelers watching, some with curiosity, others with discomfort, a few recording with their phones. Humiliation burned through her as she realized she had become a spectacle. In the small room, a female agent was waiting. She introduced herself as Melissa Kraft and offered a smile that initially gave Eleanor hope that someone might finally listen to reason. Professor Washington, I understand there's some confusion about your travel documentation. Kraft began, her tone more respectful than her colleagues. Let's try to sort this out. For a brief moment, Eleanor thought the nightmare might end. Then she saw Hayes slide her passport across the table to Kraft, muttering diplomatic visa. Obviously fraudulent. Kraft's demeanor changed instantly. The smile disappeared as she opened the passport to examine the visa page. Professor Washington, obtaining or attempting to travel with fraudulent documentation is a serious federal offense, she said, her voice now cold and official. That visa is legitimate, Eleanor insisted, her composure finally beginning to crack. Please contact the International Humanitarian Committee or the U.S. State Department if you need verification. Instead of responding to her request, the agents began a thorough search of her carry-on bag. They removed each item, examining it with exaggerated scrutiny. When they found her award notification and conference materials, Thompson flipped through them dismissively. This is quite an elaborate setup, he remarked to his colleagues, as if Eleanor weren't present. These fake documents look pretty professional. They're not fake, Eleanor protested, her voice rising slightly. My entire career is documented. You can Google me. Eleanor Washington, refugee education pioneer. 40 years of service. 3 honorary doctorates. Hayes typed something into a computer, then shook his head. Says here there's an Eleanor Washington who's a professor, but nothing about diplomatic status. Because I'm not a diplomat, I've been given a diplomatic visa specifically for this event. Kraft held up the passport, pointing to something on the visa page. This hologram doesn't look right, and the issuing code is suspicious. Eleanor felt the room tilting slightly. This couldn't be happening. Every document she carried was legitimate, obtained through proper channels, triple-checked for accuracy. I believe we have sufficient cause to detain you for attempted travel with fraudulent documents, Thompson announced. Agent Hayes, please prepare the necessary paperwork. Detain me. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. You can't possibly. Ma'am, please stand up and place your hands behind your back, Hayes instructed, producing a pair of handcuffs. Eleanor stared at the metal restraints in disbelief. In 68 years of life through the civil rights movement, through decades of subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination, through countless border crossings and international work, she had never been treated like a criminal. This is unnecessary, she said, her academic dignity finally giving way to fear. Please just call the committee, call the State Department, call my son. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. As the cold metal closed around her wrists, Eleanor Washington, distinguished professor and humanitarian, felt something break inside her. The terminal outside buzzed with normal airport activity, travelers rushing to destinations worldwide, while her life's journey ground to a halt in a small room where her identity, her accomplishments, and her very dignity were being stripped away by people who refused to see her as anything but suspicious. The small interrogation room felt like it was shrinking by the minute. Eleanor sat straight-backed in the uncomfortable metal chair, her handcuffed wrists resting awkwardly behind her. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across the institutional gray walls, making everyone look sickly and severe. TSA Supervisor Melissa Kraft pulled up a chair across from Eleanor, setting a folder on the table between them. Unlike the openly hostile Hayes and Thompson, Kraft's approach seemed more measured, almost sympathetic. She offered Eleanor a paper cup of water, which Eleanor couldn't accept with her hands restrained. Professor Washington, I understand this situation is difficult. Kraft began, her voice professionally calibrated to sound reasonable. But I'm here to help sort things out if you're willing to cooperate. A flicker of hope rose in Eleanor's chest. Perhaps this woman would be the voice of reason among them. Thank you, Eleanor replied cautiously. All I'm asking is for someone to properly verify my documentation. A simple phone call to the International Humanitarian Committee would clear everything up immediately. Kraft nodded, as if considering this reasonable request, then opened the folder and spread out copies of Eleanor's passport, visa, and invitation letter. The issue, Professor, is that diplomatic visas like this one are extremely restricted documents, she explained, pointing to the visa page. They're typically only issued to accredited diplomats, high-ranking international officials, or those directly employed by international governing bodies. Yes, I understand that, Eleanor replied patiently. As I've explained, this was specially arranged because of the nature of the award and the meetings with UN officials that are part of the ceremony. The committee handled all the paperwork through proper State Department channels. Kraft's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Professor Washington, in my 15 years with TSA and border security, I've never seen a diplomatic visa issued to a retired academic for receiving an award. The brief hope Eleanor had felt evaporated. Kraft wasn't an ally. She was simply employing a different technique to reach the same conclusion her colleagues had already determined. Just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean it isn't legitimate, Eleanor insisted, struggling to keep the frustration from her voice. Hayes entered the room carrying Eleanor's carry-on bag and began methodically removing its contents onto the table. Let's go through your belongings again, he announced, not bothering to look at Eleanor. One by one, he laid out her items, conference materials, acceptance speech, professional biography, schedule of events, and the small gift from Aisha that Eleanor hadn't yet opened. He unfolded her neatly packed clothes, checked pockets, and even examined the lining of her bag. When he came to her portfolio containing her professional credentials, award certificates, and documentation of her humanitarian work, he flipped through it dismissively. Quite the collection of papers you've assembled here, he remarked with thinly veiled sarcasm. Those are my legitimate professional credentials, Eleanor said firmly. 40 years of documented academic and humanitarian work. Hayes pulled out her University of Minnesota Professor Emeritus card, her honorary doctorate certificates, and photos of her with international dignitaries at various humanitarian events over the decades. Anyone can create impressive-looking documents these days, Thompson commented from the doorway. Entire operations exist to create fake credentials. Eleanor couldn't believe what she was hearing. Are you suggesting that my entire career is fabricated? That 3 universities conferred honorary doctorates on a fictional person? That decades of humanitarian work documented in academic journals and international publications is all an elaborate hoax? Kraft picked up one of the photos showing Eleanor with the Secretary General of the United Nations at a refugee education conference 5 years earlier. Photoshop has gotten very sophisticated, she said, studying the image. This is well done. Eleanor felt like she had stepped into an alternate reality where nothing she said mattered and no evidence she provided would be considered legitimate. This is absurd, she finally said, her voice trembling slightly. I've dedicated my entire life to education and humanitarian work. I've published 12 books and over 100 academic papers. I've established schools in refugee camps across 3 continents. And you're suggesting I've manufactured an entire career to, what, get a fraudulent visa to Switzerland? Hayes ignored her outburst, focusing instead on her passport. The bigger issue is this diplomatic visa. It's obviously altered. The holographic security elements don't match our reference samples. That's impossible, Eleanor insisted. I received that passport and visa directly from official channels. Did you pay someone to help you obtain this visa? Thompson asked. Suddenly, his tone accusatory. Sometimes people think they're going through official channels when they're actually dealing with fraudulent services. Absolutely not. Eleanor was appalled at the suggestion. The committee handled everything through their diplomatic connections. I filled out the paperwork they sent me and submitted everything through proper State Department protocols. And yet here we are, with a clearly fraudulent diplomatic visa, Hayes stated, as if the matter were settled. Eleanor took a deep breath, fighting to maintain her composure. If you would just make a phone call to verify. We've heard enough about phone calls, Thompson interrupted. Right now, we're dealing with the evidence in front of us, which indicates you're attempting to travel internationally using fraudulent documentation. That's a federal offense. Kraft collected the documents and photos, returning them to the folder. I'm afraid we'll need to detain you pending further investigation and potential criminal charges. Criminal charges, Eleanor echoed in disbelief. For accepting an award, for attempting to cross international borders with fraudulent documents, Hayes corrected. We'll be contacting the FBI. In the meantime, we need to process you and move you to a secure holding area. I want to call my attorney, Eleanor stated firmly, drawing on her knowledge of her rights. You'll be allowed to make calls after processing, Thompson replied dismissively. Eleanor realized with growing horror that things were about to get much worse. Her wrists ached from the handcuffs, her heart raced with anxiety, and the indignity of being treated like a criminal was almost unbearable. Throughout her life, she had faced discrimination in many forms, but never had she been subjected to such blatant disregard for her humanity. Stand up, please, Hayes instructed. We need to move you through the terminal to the detention area. Through the terminal, in handcuffs, Eleanor asked, aghast at the thought. Standard protocol, Thompson stated flatly. Let's go. As they led her toward the door, Eleanor thought about all the dignity she had maintained through decades of subtle and not so subtle racism, sexism, and ageism. She had always held her head high, determined to be a role model for her students and the communities she served. Now she was about to be paraded through a crowded international terminal in handcuffs, publicly humiliated based on unfounded suspicions, and she was increasingly convinced racial bias. The door opened and Eleanor stepped out, escorted by Hayes and Thompson with Kraft following behind. As they moved into the brightly lit main terminal, she felt the weight of countless eyes turning toward her. Her lifetime of accomplishments, her dignity, her very identity seemed to evaporate under those stares replaced by the image of a black woman in handcuffs being escorted by authorities. In that moment, Eleanor Washington, distinguished professor and humanitarian, felt more vulnerable and exposed than she had in her entire life. The main terminal of JFK International Airport stretched before Eleanor like a gauntlet she was being forced to walk. Bright overhead lights illuminated every step of her humiliation as Agent Hayes led her forward, one hand firmly gripping her upper arm despite the handcuffs that already restrained her. Agent Thompson walked slightly ahead, clearing a path, while Supervisor Kraft followed behind. Travelers stopped mid-stride, conversations halted, and heads turned to watch the procession. Eleanor felt each stare like a physical touch against her skin. Some people quickly averted their eyes, uncomfortable with the spectacle. Others gawked openly, their expressions ranging from curiosity to judgment to pity. Worst of all were those who instantly pulled out their phones, recording her shame for social media consumption. "Keep moving, Hayes," instructed when Eleanor's steps faltered momentarily under the weight of public scrutiny. Eleanor forced herself to put one foot in front of the other. Throughout her life, she had cultivated a particular way of carrying herself. Back straight, head high, movements deliberate and dignified. It was a posture born from necessity, a black woman navigating predominantly white spaces during times when her very presence was considered an intrusion. Now, with her hands cuffed behind her back and security personnel flanking her, that carefully constructed dignity was being systematically dismantled. "What's she done?" Eleanor heard someone whisper loudly to their companion. "Terrorist," maybe came the speculative response. The casual ease with which a stranger could look at her, a 68-year-old educator, and jump to terrorist, sent a wave of nausea through Eleanor's body. "I am a professor," she said, clearly addressing no one in particular, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "This is a mistake. My documentation is legitimate." "Ma'am, remain silent during transport," Thompson ordered sharply. But Eleanor had spent too many years teaching others to stand up for themselves to remain silent now. "I am Dr. Eleanor Washington, Professor Emeritus of International Education. I'm being detained due to an error regarding my diplomatic visa for a humanitarian award ceremony." Hayes tightened his grip on her arm. "That's enough. One more word and we'll add interfering with security procedures to the charges." Eleanor caught her reflection in the glass wall of a duty-free shop as they passed. The image nearly stopped her heart. An elderly black woman in handcuffs, surrounded by uniformed authorities. For a moment, she didn't recognize herself. Was this really happening? Was this distinguished woman with silver hair wearing her best navy blue traveling suit actually being paraded through a major international airport like a dangerous criminal? Her mind flashed back to her classroom at the university where she had taught generations of students about maintaining dignity in the face of injustice. "There will be moments," she had told them, "when the world seems determined to strip you of your humanity. Those are precisely the moments when you must hold on to it most tightly." How many times had she spoken those words? How many students had nodded in theoretical understanding? But now, living this moment, the gap between academic discussion and painful reality yawned wide before her. As they approached a busier section of the terminal, Eleanor noticed a young black woman in an airport uniform watching the scene with wide, horrified eyes. Their gazes locked for a brief moment, and Eleanor saw in the young woman's face a reflection of her own pain, the unique anguish of witnessing a black elder being humiliated publicly, coupled with the terrifying knowledge that it could just as easily be her. Eleanor tried to stand taller to communicate through posture alone. "Don't let this break you. Don't let this become normal." The young woman gave an almost imperceptible nod before her supervisor called her back to work. As they continued through the terminal, Eleanor's panic began to rise. What would happen next? Would she be locked in a cell? Would criminal charges actually be filed? How long would it take before someone listened to reason? Would she miss her award ceremony entirely? What would Terrence think when she didn't arrive in Geneva as planned? She thought of all the borders she had crossed in her humanitarian work, checkpoints and conflict zones. remote crossings in developing nations, areas where governments were openly hostile to Americans. Never once had she been detained. Never once had her documentation been questioned. Yet here in her own country, she was being treated like an imposter, a fraud, a criminal. "Almost there," Thompson announced as they approached a door marked "Security Personnel Only." Eleanor knew that once she passed through that door, she would disappear from public view. Whatever happened next would occur, away from witnesses, away from the phones, recording her humiliation, away from any possibility of chance intervention. The realization sent a chill through her body. Her parents had lived through the civil rights era. They had told her stories of disappeared activists, of abuses that occurred out of sight. Though she knew JFK Airport in 2023 was not Mississippi in 1963, the deeply ingrained fear passed down through generations surfaced unbidden. "I have rights," she stated firmly as they reached the door. "I demand to call my attorney and my family immediately." Thompson punched a code into the keypad beside the door. "You'll be allowed to make calls after processing," he repeated the same empty promise he'd made earlier. The doors swung open, revealing a stark corridor leading to what Eleanor assumed was the airport detention area. As she stood on the threshold, she caught her reflection once more, this time in the dark glass of a security camera mounted overhead. In that reflection, she saw not just herself, but generations of Black Americans who had faced similar indignities with similar courage. She saw her parents who had marched for equality. She saw her grandparents who had endured Jim Crow. She saw her son Terrence, who still faced random security screenings despite his executive position. And in that moment, Eleanor made a decision. Whatever happened next, she would not be broken. This humiliation would not define her. Somehow, she would reclaim her dignity, her identity, and her truth. Is this kind of treatment still happening at our airports in 2023? Have you or someone you know ever experienced racial profiling while traveling? Comment number 1 if you believe racial bias plays a role in security screenings, or comment number 2 if you think security personnel are just doing their jobs. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to see more stories that expose the injustices many face every day. But wait, what happens when Eleanor disappears behind those security doors? Will anyone speak up for her, or will the system continue to railroad this distinguished educator? Let's find out as our story continues. James Walker was running late for his flight to Boston. At 45, the corporate attorney had mastered the art of efficient travel. Pre-check, carry-on only boarding pass on his phone. But an extended client meeting had thrown off his carefully planned schedule. Now he was moving briskly through JFK's crowded terminal, weaving between slower travelers while mentally reviewing his upcoming deposition prep. That's when he noticed the commotion. A cluster of people with phones raised, recording something. Normally, Walker would have hurried past, focused on his own agenda, but something about the scene made him slow his pace. Through gaps in the crowd, he caught glimpses of an elderly Black woman in handcuffs being escorted by airport security. Walker hesitated. He had a flight, to catch a schedule, to maintain a career that rewarded efficiency and discouraged detours. But something about the woman's dignified bearing, despite her circumstances, nagged at his conscience. 3 months earlier, Walker's law firm had implemented mandatory diversity and inclusion training following a discrimination lawsuit. Like many of his colleagues, he had initially viewed the sessions as a corporate box-checking exercise. But the statistics had stayed with him. Black travelers were disproportionately subjected to random screenings, additional questioning, and detainment. The trainer had called it flying while black, a variation on the better-known driving while black. At the time, Walker had thought to himself that the statistics must be exaggerated. Now, watching security personnel parade an elderly woman through a public terminal in handcuffs, he wondered if he had been wrong. Before he fully realized what he was doing, Walker stepped away from his path to the gate and moved toward the scene. By the time he reached the edge of the gathered onlookers, the security team was approaching a door marked for authorized personnel only. Walker made a split-second decision. Setting down his briefcase, he strode forward with the confident bearing that had served him well in courtrooms across the country. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice clear and authoritative. "May I ask what's happening here?" Agent Thompson turned visibly annoyed at the interruption. "Sir, please step back. This is a security matter." Walker maintained his position. "I can see that. I'm simply inquiring about the situation." He directed his attention to Eleanor. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Eleanor's eyes met his surprise, momentarily overtaking her distress. In that brief exchange of glances, Walker saw both dignity and desperation. "They're detaining me because they claim my diplomatic visa is fraudulent," she explained quickly. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Washington, a professor receiving a humanitarian award in Geneva. My documentation is legitimate, but they refuse to verify it." Hayes stepped between them. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. Please continue to your gate." Walker stood his ground. "Actually, I'm an attorney, and I'm concerned about what appears to be a potential case of wrongful detention." "Are you her lawyer?" Thompson challenged. "No, but—" "Then this is none of your business," Hayes cut in. "Security procedures are in progress, and you're interfering." Walker weighed his options quickly. He wasn't a criminal defense attorney. His specialty was corporate law, specifically mergers and acquisitions. He had no jurisdiction here, no official standing to intervene. But the fundamental legal principles of due process and evidence applied universally. "Dr. Washington," he addressed Eleanor directly, ignoring the increasingly hostile security agents, "have they allowed you to contact legal representation?" "No," Eleanor replied. "They've taken my phone and refused my requests to make calls." Walker turned to Thompson, who appeared to be the senior officer. "Sir, you're aware the detainees have the right to legal counsel, correct? Preventing her from contacting an attorney could constitute a serious violation of her rights." Thompson's expression darkened. "We're following standard security protocols for suspected document fraud. She'll be allowed to make calls after processing." "What evidence do you have that her documentation is fraudulent?" Walker pressed. "That's confidential security information," Hayes snapped. "Has anyone actually verified with the issuing authorities whether her visa is legitimate?" Walker continued undeterred. "A simple phone call to the State Department or the humanitarian organization could resolve this immediately." Supervisor Kraft, who had remained mostly silent during the exchange, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we have procedures we need to follow." Walker reached into his jacket pocket and extracted his business card. "James Walker, Senior Partner, Aldridge & Moore." He presented it to Thompson. "I'm formally requesting that you allow Dr. Washington to contact her attorney before any further processing occurs." Thompson glanced at the card, his expression wavering slightly at the prestigious law firm's name. "Mr. Walker, I understand your concern, but you need to step back now or I'll have to consider you an obstruction to security operations." Walker recognized the threat for what it was, but something in him refused to walk away. Perhaps it was the diversity training statistics echoing in his mind, or perhaps it was simply the striking contrast between this distinguished elderly woman and the treatment she was receiving. "I'd like to observe her processing then," Walker stated firmly, "to ensure proper procedures are followed." "Absolutely not," Hayes interjected. "Authorized personnel only." Walker noticed that the crowd of onlookers had grown and more phones were recording the confrontation. He made another quick decision, removing his own phone from his pocket. "Then I'll be documenting this interaction," he announced, starting to record, including the refusal to allow a detainee to contact legal representation. "I'm sure my firm's social media team will find this compelling content, as might several journalists I work with regularly." Thompson's expression transformed from annoyance to alarm. Airport security departments were increasingly sensitive to negative publicity, especially involving potential discrimination. "Sir, recording security procedures is prohibited," he stated, though with less conviction. Recording in public areas of the airport is perfectly legal, Walker countered smoothly. And we are currently in a public terminal, not a restricted area. Eleanor watched this exchange with growing hope, standing straighter despite her restraints. They claim my diplomatic visa must be fake because I'm just a retired teacher, she explained to Walker deliberately loud enough for nearby travelers to hear. Despite my 40-year career as a professor and humanitarian, Walker kept his phone recording as he addressed the security team. So your primary reason for detention is skepticism that someone of Dr. Washington's description would have legitimate credentials for international humanitarian work. That seems problematic. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Supervisor Kraft whispered something to Thompson, who frowned deeply. We have evidence of document inconsistencies, Thompson insisted, though his tone had lost some of its certainty. Then surely you won't object to a simple verification call, Walker pressed. If the documents are indeed fraudulent, a call will confirm that. If they're legitimate, you avoid a potential lawsuit for wrongful detention and discrimination. The standoff continued, with Walker refusing to back down and the security team increasingly aware of the growing audience of recording bystanders. The atmosphere in the terminal had shifted palpably. What had started as passive observation of someone else's misfortune was evolving into active witness to a potential injustice. Thompson was about to respond when a commotion near the terminal entrance drew everyone's attention. Black SUVs with diplomatic flags had pulled up outside, and a security detail was clearing a path through the main doors. "What now?" Hayes muttered, glancing nervously toward the new development. Walker had no idea who was arriving, but he recognized an opportunity when he saw one. Whatever was happening had momentarily diverted the security team's attention, giving him a chance to strengthen his position as Eleanor's impromptu advocate. "I'm staying right here with Dr. Washington until this is resolved properly," he stated firmly, stepping closer to her. "And I strongly suggest you reconsider your approach before this situation escalates further." Little did Walker know just how dramatically things were about to escalate, or that his impulsive decision to intervene would soon be overshadowed by the arrival of someone with far more authority than a corporate attorney with a boarding pass to Boston and a nagging conscience. The commotion at the terminal entrance grew louder as security personnel rushed to form a perimeter. 3 black SUVs with small American flags mounted on their hoods had pulled up directly outside the doors, a privilege normally reserved for diplomatic delegations and high-ranking officials. Men and women in dark suits with earpieces and alert expressions moved purposefully into the terminal, scanning the area with professional vigilance. Eleanor and her unlikely defender, James Walker, watched as the security detail parted the crowd, creating a clear path from the entrance. The airport security agents detaining Eleanor, Thompson, Hayes, and Kraft, also turned their attention to the unexpected arrivals, momentarily distracted from their standoff. From the center vehicle emerged a tall, distinguished African-American man in his early 60s. His bespoke suit and commanding presence marked him as someone accustomed to authority. The security detail surrounded him smoothly as he moved into the terminal, nodding acknowledgments to airport officials who rushed forward to greet him. "Who is that Walker?" murmured, still recording with his phone. Eleanor squinted, trying to get a better look through the crowd. "I can't quite see." The distinguished man was escorted efficiently through the terminal by both his personal security and airport officials. He appeared to be headed toward a VIP lounge, or private security checkpoint, following a route that would take him past Eleanor's position. As the entourage approached, the man was deep in conversation with an aide walking beside him. Something in the terminal caught his attention, however, and he glanced up, scanning the unusual gathering of people with phones raised. His gaze swept past, then suddenly returned, fixing on Eleanor standing in handcuffs between the security agents. The change in his expression was instant and dramatic, from diplomatic neutrality to shocked recognition. "Eleanor," he called out, breaking away from his security detail with a quickness that momentarily caught them off guard. Eleanor's eyes widened as the man approached. "William," she gasped in disbelief. Thompson stepped forward, attempting to intercept. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back. This is a security." The man cut him off with an authoritative gesture. "I am Ambassador William Richardson, United States Ambassador to Switzerland and Liechtenstein. What is happening here?" The atmosphere in the terminal shifted instantly. Thompson's confident demeanor faltered, Hayes took an involuntary step backward, and Kraft's professional mask slipped to reveal naked alarm. Ambassador Richardson Eleanor said, her voice steadier now. "These officers have detained me, claiming my diplomatic visa for Geneva is fraudulent. They've refused to verify it with proper authorities, and were about to take me to a detention center." Richardson's expression darkened as he took in the handcuffs securing Eleanor's wrists behind her back. "Remove those immediately," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Hayes hesitated, looking to Thompson for direction. "Sir, with all due respect," Thompson began, "we have protocols for suspected document fraud." "I said remove them," Richardson repeated, each word precisely enunciated. "Dr. Eleanor Washington is a distinguished academic and humanitarian, whom I know personally. She is scheduled to receive the Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Humanitarian Committee in Geneva tomorrow evening, an event I will be attending officially as the U.S. representative." The terminal had gone remarkably quiet as travelers and airport staff alike watched the extraordinary confrontation unfold. Walker continued recording, capturing the security agent's growing discomfort. When Hayes still didn't move to uncuff, Eleanor Richardson turned to one of his security detail. "Agent Pearson, please assist Dr. Washington." A woman from the ambassador's detail stepped forward, producing a small key from her pocket that remarkably fit the standard-issue TSA handcuffs. With efficient movements, she unlocked the restraints and gently removed them from Eleanor's wrists. Eleanor rubbed her chafed skin, maintaining her dignity despite the relief that flooded through her. Ambassador Richardson turned his attention back to Thompson. "I want a full explanation of this situation immediately." Thompson's composure had evaporated entirely. "Sir, we identified irregularities in her diplomatic visa during routine screening. Our protocols require—" "What specific irregularities?" Richardson interrupted. The holographic elements appeared inconsistent with our reference samples Hayes offered quickly, and the issuing code sequence seemed unusual. Richardson extended his hand toward Eleanor. "May I see your passport, Eleanor?" She nodded toward Agent Kraft. "They've confiscated it, along with my phone and belongings." Richardson's gaze shifted to Kraft, who hurriedly retrieved Eleanor's passport from a security pouch. She handed it to the ambassador with visible trepidation. Richardson opened the passport, turning directly to the visa page. He examined it briefly, then looked up with controlled anger. "This visa was issued through my office 3 weeks ago. I personally signed off on the documentation." He held up the page, pointing to a small marking in the corner. "This authentication code is from the Diplomatic Security Bureau in Bern. It's absolutely legitimate." Hayes paled visibly. "Sir, our reference materials are apparently outdated," Richardson finished for him. "The Swiss diplomatic security protocols were updated last month, which you would know if you had simply made a verification call to the State Department as Dr. Washington repeatedly requested." Walker stepped forward, emboldened by the ambassador's arrival. "Sir, I'm James Walker, an attorney who witnessed part of this incident." "They refused, Dr. Washington's requests to contact legal counsel and were about to remove her to a detention area when I intervened." Richardson acknowledged Walker with a nod before turning back to the security team. "Where is your supervisor?" "Not you," he clarified when Kraft began to speak. "The terminal security director." "I'll contact Director Phillips immediately," Thompson said, reaching for his radio with unsteady hands. The ambassador turned to Eleanor, his official demeanor softening slightly. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry you've experienced this. Are you all right?" "I've been better, William," she answered, with remarkable composure given the circumstances. "But I'm more concerned about making my flight to Geneva. The awards ceremony is tomorrow evening, I know. I'll be presenting the official U.S. Congratulations." Richardson smiled briefly. "We can arrange alternative transportation if necessary." One of the ambassador's aides approached respectfully. "Sir, we have a schedule to maintain." "Adjust the schedule," Richardson replied firmly. "This situation requires my attention." By now, a man in a suit with an airport director's badge hurried toward them, alarm evident in every line of his face. "Ambassador Richardson, I'm Kenneth Phillips, JFK Terminal Security Director. I've just been informed of the situation. Please accept my deepest apologies for this misunderstanding." "This was far more than a misunderstanding," Director Richardson stated. "This was, at minimum, a catastrophic failure of your security protocols, and at worst," he left the implication hanging in the air. Phillips paled. "I assure you, we take these matters extremely seriously. If you and Dr. Washington would please accompany me to my office, we can address this properly away from the terminal floor." Richardson looked to Eleanor, who nodded her agreement. "Very well," the ambassador said, "but Dr. Washington's belongings are to be returned immediately, and I expect a full accounting of this incident." As Phillips directed his staff to gather Eleanor's possessions, the dynamics in the terminal had completely transformed. The security agents who had been so dismissive of Eleanor's explanations now stood awkwardly to the side, avoiding eye contact. Travelers who had watched her humiliation now witnessed her vindication, many still recording on their phones. Walker, seeing that the situation had dramatically shifted in Eleanor's favor, approached her once more. "Dr. Washington, I should give you my contact information in case you need a witness statement regarding what occurred here." Eleanor accepted his business card with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Walker. Your willingness to speak up when others simply watched. I won't forget that." The ambassador's security detail had reorganized, creating a protective formation around both Richardson and Eleanor. As they prepared to follow Director Phillips to his office, Eleanor caught a glimpse of the young black airport employee she had noticed earlier. The young woman was smiling, now giving Eleanor a subtle thumbs up of solidarity. Eleanor straightened her jacket, smoothed her silver hair, and walked alongside Ambassador Richardson with her head held high. The same terminal that had witnessed her humiliation now witnessed her restored dignity. The journey that had so nearly derailed was back on track, though forever altered by the experience. As they moved toward the director's office, Eleanor was keenly aware that this incident, traumatic as it had been, was far from over. The immediate crisis might have been resolved by Ambassador Richardson's timely arrival, but the deeper issues it exposed would require a different kind of resolution altogether. Director Kenneth Phillips's office bore all the hallmarks of airport administrative authority: awards and certifications on the walls, models of aircraft on shelves, and a large desk positioned to project maximum authority. Now, however, the man behind that desk looked anything but authoritative as he faced Ambassador Richardson and Eleanor Washington. "Once again, Dr. Washington, please accept my sincerest apologies for this unfortunate incident." Phillips began, his hands clasped nervously on the desk. "I assure you this is not representative of our security procedures." "Yet it happened," Ambassador Richardson noted, coolly standing rather than taking one of the offered chairs. "And would have continued happening if I hadn't coincidentally been passing through the terminal." Eleanor sat with perfect posture in the chair across from Phillips, her recently returned passport clutched in her hands. The familiar document, which had traveled with her across dozens of countries during her humanitarian work, now felt different somehow, its authority and protection temporarily suspended by prejudice and bureaucracy. "I want to understand exactly how this occurred," she said, her academic precision returning as shock gave way to analytical clarity. "At what point did your agents decide my documentation was fraudulent, and why did they refuse every reasonable request for verification?" Phillips glanced uncomfortably at Agent Thompson, who stood rigidly by the wall alongside Hayes and Kraft. "Agent Thompson, please explain your assessment process." Thompson cleared his throat. The diplomatic visa contained security features that appeared inconsistent with our reference materials. Given that Dr. Washington is not a government official, additional scrutiny seemed warranted. And yet Ambassador Richardson interjected a simple phone call to the State Department would have immediately confirmed the visa's legitimacy. Why wasn't this standard verification performed? We follow a tiered verification process, Thompson replied, choosing his words carefully. Initial assessment, secondary screening, and only then external verification if necessary. Eleanor set her passport on the desk with deliberate control. In other words, you decided I was guilty until proven innocent. My explanations were dismissed, my credentials ignored, and my repeated requests for verification denied. Dr. Washington I. Hayes began. Agent Hayes Eleanor cut him off with surprising sharpness. You looked at my humanitarian award documentation and called it elaborate fakes. You dismissed 40 years of academic credentials because they didn't fit your perception of who I must be. The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. Ambassador Richardson stepped forward, placing his government phone on Phillips's desk. I've taken the liberty of contacting the State Department's Diplomatic Security Service. They've confirmed that Dr. Washington's visa is not only legitimate, but was processed through priority diplomatic channels due to her status with the International Humanitarian Committee. Phillips winced visibly. Ambassador Richardson, I appreciate your thoroughness, but I assure you we would have reached the same conclusion through our standard protocols. When Eleanor asked simply, after I'd been detained for hours, after I'd missed my flight, after I'd been fingerprinted and photographed like a criminal, after I'd missed receiving the award, I've worked 40 years to earn. Before Phillips could respond, there was a knock at the door. A young assistant entered, looking anxious. Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something you need to see immediately. She handed Phillips a tablet. The director's expression transformed from uncomfortable to horrified as he viewed whatever was on the screen. How many views? He asked weakly. Over 50,000 and climbing rapidly, the assistant replied. It's being picked up by major news outlets now. Phillips turned the tablet around, revealing a social media video titled, Black Professor Handcuffed at JFK for Fake Passport Until U.S. Ambassador Intervenes. The footage, apparently shot by one of the bystanders, clearly showed Eleanor in handcuffs, surrounded by security personnel, followed by Ambassador Richardson's dramatic arrival and intervention. This is what I was trying to prevent by suggesting verification, James Walker noted from the corner where he had been quietly observing. Phillips had reluctantly allowed the attorney to accompany them after Eleanor insisted on having a witness present. Eleanor watched the video with a strange detachment, as if observing something that had happened to someone else. There she was, handcuffed, and surrounded her dignity under assault. And there was Ambassador Richardson, his authority immediately unquestioned, where hers had been immediately suspect. Director Phillips Richardson said, his tone measured but severe, this has escalated beyond a simple misunderstanding. The State Department will be conducting a formal review of this incident, and I expect your full cooperation. Phillips nodded numbly, his attention still fixed on the viral video that was becoming a full-blown PR catastrophe by the second. Eleanor's phone recently returned to her, buzzed with incoming messages. She glanced at the screen to see dozens of notifications. Missed calls from Terrence, texts from Aisha, news alerts mentioning her name, and social media tags from complete strangers. My son, she murmured suddenly, remembering Terrence would have no idea what had happened. I need to call my son. Of course, Phillips said quickly, eager to show some measure of accommodation. You can use my office for privacy if you'd like. Eleanor nodded, moving to a corner of the room as she dialed Terrence's number. He answered on the first ring. Mom, are you okay? I just saw a video online. I'm all right, Terrence, she assured him, though her voice wavered slightly. There was an incident with security, but Ambassador Richardson happened to be here and intervened. I'm coming to the airport right now, Terrence stated firmly. That's not necessary. Mom, you were in handcuffs. I'm already in the car. Eleanor didn't have the energy to argue. Perhaps having Terrence here would be a comfort after all. While Eleanor spoke with her son, Ambassador Richardson was engaged in an increasingly tense conversation with Phillips and the security agents. Agents Thompson and Hayes will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation, Phillips was saying. Supervisor Kraft will— "That's only the beginning," Richardson interrupted. "This incident reflects systemic issues in your security protocols. The ease with which legitimate documentation was dismissed, the rush to criminalize rather than verify the public humiliation of a distinguished citizen. These point to deeper problems than individual agent misconduct." Hayes, who had remained largely silent, suddenly spoke up. "With all due respect, sir, we were following established procedures for suspected document fraud." Eleanor, finishing her call with Terrence, turned her attention back to the room just in time to hear Hayes's defense. "Agent Hayes," she said, returning to her seat, "when you examined my academic credentials and humanitarian award notification, you dismissed them as elaborate fakes. What about my profile suggested I would create false, quote, documents claiming to be a professor and humanitarian rather than actually being one?" Hayes shifted uncomfortably under her direct questioning. "Ma'am, document fraud comes in many forms. We're trained to be suspicious of unusual combinations, in this case a diplomatic visa for someone without diplomatic status. Yet you never once considered that my documentation might actually be legitimate," Eleanor pressed. "Why is that?" The loaded question hung in the air, its implications clear to everyone in the room. Walker, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "Director Phillips, I've witnessed enough to believe there are grounds for a civil rights complaint here. Racial profiling and security screening is explicitly prohibited by TSA regulations." Phillips paled further. "Mr. Walker, we categorically deny that race played any factor." "Statistics suggest otherwise," Walker interrupted smoothly. "My firm recently reviewed data showing Black travelers are subjected to additional screening at rates significantly higher than their white counterparts, Doctor. Washington's experience appears consistent with these patterns." Ambassador Richardson checked his watch. "Director, while I appreciate your willingness to address this situation, Dr. Washington has a flight to Geneva to catch, or had one rather. What arrangements are being made to ensure she reaches her destination in time for tomorrow's ceremony?" Phillips seized on the practical question with visible relief. "Of course, we're arranging first-class accommodation on the next available flight. All expenses covered by the Port Authority, naturally." "And what about compensation for the emotional distress and public humiliation Dr. Washington has suffered?" Walker asked. "That's a matter that would need to be discussed with our legal department," Phillips hedged. Eleanor, who had been quietly processing everything, finally spoke. "I didn't ask for any of this. I simply wanted to travel to Geneva to receive recognition for my life's work. Instead, I've been handcuffed, paraded through a public terminal accused of fraud, and prevented from contacting my family or legal counsel." Her quiet dignity made the statement more powerful than any angry outburst could have been. "The damage done today extends beyond me," she continued. "Every Black traveler who witnessed my detention now carries that fear. Every person who watched the video now has confirmation of their worst suspicions about how people who look like me are treated by authorities." Ambassador Richardson placed a supportive hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "Director Phillips, I suggest you focus less on damage control and more on meaningful reform. This incident will have diplomatic repercussions, particularly given Dr. Washington's standing in international humanitarian circles." Before Phillips could respond, the door opened again to admit a tall, well-dressed Black man in his early 40s, his face tight with controlled anger. "Mom, Terrence Washington," said, moving immediately to Eleanor's side. "Terrence," she breathed, rising to embrace her son. "How did you get here so quickly?" "I was already heading to surprise you at the airport when I saw the video," he explained, holding her at arm's length to examine her condition. "Are you really okay?" "I am now," she assured him, though the slight tremor in her hands betrayed the toll the ordeal had taken. Terrence turned to face the room, his protective stance making his relationship to Eleanor clear. "I want to know exactly what happened and who's responsible." The tables had completely turned. Where hours earlier Eleanor had stood alone, dismissed and disbelieved by authorities, she now had an ambassador, an attorney, and her son forming a united front of support and advocacy. The security agents who had wielded such absolute power now looked small and uncertain, while Director Phillips visibly calculated the professional and institutional damage this incident would cause. As Eleanor watched this transformation, she felt a complex mixture of vindication, lingering humiliation, and profound weariness. The battle had been won, but at a cost she shouldn't have had to pay. And beyond this room, beyond this airport, how many others faced similar treatment without the coincidental intervention of an ambassador? This thought more than any other solidified her resolve. What had happened to her today wasn't just a personal injustice. It was a symptom of a deeper systemic problem. And if there was one thing Eleanor Washington had dedicated her life to, it was addressing systemic problems through education, advocacy, and action. The humanitarian award waiting for her in Geneva suddenly seemed like just the beginning of a new chapter in her lifelong work. The administrative offices of JFK International Airport hummed with tense activity. What had begun as a routine security incident had transformed into a full-blown crisis that now involved a U.S. ambassador, viral social media exposure, and potential legal action. In a private medical room adjacent to Director Phillips's office, a nurse checked Eleanor's blood pressure while Ambassador Richardson conferred with his staff in hushed tones. "Your blood pressure is significantly elevated, Dr. Washington," the nurse informed her with concern. 160/95. Have you experienced any dizziness or headache? Eleanor nodded slightly. Some tension at the base of my skull. Nothing serious. Given your age and the stress you've experienced, I'd recommend medical observation before you travel, the nurse advised. Terrence, who hadn't left his mother's side since arriving, immediately agreed. "Mom, maybe we should postpone Geneva. Your health comes first." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "I've worked too hard and too long to miss this ceremony. I'll rest on the plane." The nurse provided Eleanor with water and a mild pain reliever as Ambassador Richardson approached. "The State Department is fully engaged now," he informed her quietly. "The secretary has been briefed personally." Eleanor raised an eyebrow in surprise. "William, surely this doesn't warrant attention at that level." "It does when it involves racial profiling of a distinguished American citizen with international standing compounded by a diplomatic visa issue, all captured on video that's now being broadcast internationally." Richardson's expression was grim. "The Swiss ambassador to the U.S. has already called to express concern about your treatment, given your scheduled meetings with their officials." The door opened as James Walker returned from making several calls of his own. The attorney had fully committed himself to Eleanor's situation, his missed flight to Boston now the least of his concerns. "The video has surpassed 2 million views," he reported. "News crews are gathering outside the terminal. I've been contacted by 3 civil rights organizations offering legal support, and my firm's managing partners have authorized me to represent you pro bono if you wish." Eleanor massaged her temples, overwhelmed by how quickly events were spiraling beyond her control. What she had experienced as a profoundly personal humiliation was rapidly becoming a public symbol of something much larger. Director Phillips entered looking harried. "We've prepared a private lounge for Dr. Washington and arranged priority boarding on the next flight to Geneva, departing in 3 hours. A formal statement from airport authorities is being prepared." He hesitated before adding, "We've also received inquiries from multiple news organizations requesting statements." "I have no interest in speaking to the press right now," Eleanor stated firmly. "That's wise," Walker agreed. "Any public statement should come after careful consideration of the legal implications." Ambassador Richardson checked his watch. "My security team can escort you to the private lounge, Eleanor. I'll need to continue my scheduled meetings, but I'll join you in Geneva as planned for tomorrow's ceremony." Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened again to admit a young woman from Phillips's staff, her expression tense. "Sir Agents Thompson and Hayes have been officially placed on administrative leave, effective immediately." And She glanced uncomfortably at Eleanor. The social media situation is escalating rapidly. There are calls for protests outside JFK, and several hashtags are trending. Phillips rubbed his forehead. Which hashtags? Number Justice for Eleanor and number Flying While Black are the most prominent, the assistant replied. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Her name, her identity, her experience, all were becoming public property, reshaped into symbols and slogans beyond her control. Dr. Washington Phillips said his tone carefully measured. Airport authorities would like to offer compensation for this unfortunate incident. We can arrange. I'm not interested in discussing compensation right now, Eleanor interrupted, rising from her chair with deliberate dignity. What I want is assurance that what happened to me won't happen to someone else tomorrow. Phillips nodded awkwardly. We're already implementing a review of our security protocols. A review isn't enough, Terrence interjected sharply. There need to be concrete changes in training, oversight, and accountability. I agree, Ambassador Richardson added. The State Department will be following up formally on these points. Walker, who had been examining something on his phone, looked up with renewed concern. Dr. Washington, I think you should see this before you decide how to proceed. He handed her his phone, displaying a social media post from the young black airport employee Eleanor had noticed during her detention. The post read, "Watch security handcuff and humiliate a distinguished black professor today for no reason. This happens every day to black travelers, but most don't have ambassadors to save them. Number, Flying While Black. Number, Justice for Eleanor." The post had already been shared thousands of times, with comments pouring in from black travelers sharing similar experiences of being singled out, questioned, detained, and humiliated. Eleanor handed the phone back to Walker, her academic mind already processing this new dimension. What had happened to her wasn't just a personal injustice. It was a window into a pervasive pattern affecting countless others without her advantages and connections. I need some time to think, she said finally. Of course, Phillips agreed quickly. The private lounge is ready whenever you are. As the group prepared to move Eleanor to the lounge, her phone rang again. It was Aisha. Eleanor, thank God you're all right, her daughter-in-law exclaimed. I've been trying to reach you and Terrence. It's all over the news. I'm fine, Aisha. Terrence is here with me now. The university president called our house looking for you, Aisha continued, and the dean of your old department. They're all seeing the video. People are outraged. Eleanor hadn't considered how quickly this would reach her professional circles. Please tell them I'll respond when I can. Things are still developing here. After ending the call, Eleanor turned to find Walker in conversation with a Port Authority legal representative who had just arrived. Fragments of phrases like settlement discussion and non-disclosure agreement drifted toward her. No, she stated, firmly interrupting their conversation. Both lawyers turned to her in surprise. I won't sign any non-disclosure agreement, Eleanor clarified. What happened here today needs to be addressed openly, not buried under confidential settlements. The Port Authority lawyer began to protest, but Walker held up a hand. That's my client's position. We can discuss other forms of remedy, but transparency will be non-negotiable. As they moved through the terminal toward the private lounge, Eleanor noticed the changed demeanor of every airport employee they passed. Where before she had been just another traveler, or worse, a suspicious entity to be scrutinized, she was now recognized instantly. Some averted their eyes in embarrassment, others offered sympathetic smiles, and a few nodded in subtle solidarity. In the private lounge, a stark contrast to the interrogation room where she'd been held hours earlier, Eleanor finally had a moment to collect her thoughts. Terrence sat beside her while Walker continued fielding calls and messages at a discreet distance. Mom, what do you want to do about all this? Terrence asked gently. Eleanor considered the question carefully. Throughout her career, she had always chosen her battles strategically, focusing her energy where it could create the most meaningful change. Now, fate had thrust her into a position of unexpected visibility and influence. "I want to make sure my experience serves some greater purpose," she said finally. "If what happened to me can help prevent the same thing happening to others, then perhaps some good can come of it." Terrence nodded, unsurprised by his mother's characteristic response, always looking beyond herself to the broader implications. Walker approached with an update. "The airline has confirmed your first-class accommodation to Geneva, and I've spoken with several civil rights attorneys who specialize in cases like yours. They all agree you have grounds for significant legal action if you choose to pursue it. What I choose to do will depend on how the airport authorities and TSA respond in the coming days," Eleanor replied thoughtfully. "I'm more interested in systemic change than personal compensation." As the private lounge television quietly played in the background, Eleanor noticed her own name scrolling across the news ticker. The camera cut to a reporter standing outside JFK, where a small but growing group of protesters had already gathered, many holding hastily made signs reading "Justice for Eleanor" and "Stop Racial Profiling." The speed at which her personal humiliation had transformed into a national conversation was dizzying. Eleanor Washington, who had spent decades working quietly behind the scenes focused on education rather than publicity, now found herself at the center of a burgeoning movement. "Your flight will be boarding in about an hour," a lounge attendant informed her deferentially. "Is there anything you need in the meantime, Dr. Washington?" Eleanor shook her head, still processing the dramatic reversal in how she was being treated. The same airport that had handcuffed her hours earlier was now offering her every possible accommodation and courtesy. As she prepared for her journey to Geneva, delayed but not derailed, Eleanor recognized that she stood at a crossroads. The humanitarian award waiting for her recognized her past accomplishments, but perhaps this unexpected incident had opened a door to a different kind of impact, one that addressed injustice not just in distant refugee camps, but in the 2005 everyday experiences of people who looked like her in the country she called home. Whatever she decided, Eleanor knew one thing with certainty. She would approach this new challenge with the same dignity, intelligence, and strategic vision that had guided her throughout her remarkable life. The security agents who had attempted to diminish her had instead unwittingly amplified her voice and her platform in ways they could never have anticipated. 1 week later, Eleanor Washington stood at the podium in the Grand Hall of the United Nations office in Geneva, the Golden Lifetime Achievement Award glinting beside her. The audience of international diplomats, humanitarian workers, and education advocates sat in rapt attention as she delivered a speech very different from the one she had originally prepared. "I come before you today not just as an educator and humanitarian," she began, her voice clear and strong, "but as someone whose recent experience has reinforced why our work for human dignity matters everywhere, not just in refugee camps and conflict zones, but in airports, boardrooms, and everyday encounters where people are judged by their appearance rather than their humanity." The past 7 days had been a whirlwind. After finally reaching Geneva, escorted through every airport checkpoint with excessive courtesy, Eleanor had taken a day to rest and recalibrate. With Terrence's support, she had made a crucial decision. Rather than downplaying the incident at JFK, she would incorporate it into her acceptance speech, transforming personal humiliation into a powerful call for systemic change. "Last week, I was handcuffed and publicly humiliated by airport security who decided my diplomatic visa must be fraudulent, not because of any actual evidence, but because they couldn't reconcile my black grandmother appearance with legitimate international credentials." A murmur passed through the audience. Most had heard about the incident through international news coverage, but hearing Eleanor describe it directly carried a different weight. "I was fortunate," she continued. "Ambassador Richardson happened to be passing through the terminal. My son had resources to reach me quickly. An attorney witnessed the incident and chose to intervene. But what about the thousands who face similar treatment without such advantages? Their stories rarely make headlines, yet they carry the burden of these indignities alone." In the front row, Ambassador Richardson nodded solemnly. Beside him sat James Walker, who had rescheduled his Boston deposition to attend the ceremony at Eleanor's invitation. Walker's decision to step out of his comfortable corporate law lane had evolved into a formal partnership with the foundation Eleanor was announcing today. The International Dignity Initiative will work at the intersection of education policy reform and legal advocacy, Eleanor explained, outlining the new foundation that would expand her work beyond refugee education to address discrimination in public institutions worldwide. We will document patterns of bias, develop training programs, and provide legal support to those whose dignity is violated by the very systems meant to protect them. The foundation had come together with remarkable speed. The incident at JFK had catalyzed support from across Eleanor's extensive professional network, while the viral nature of the video had brought attention from donors who might otherwise never have known her work. What had begun as a humiliating detainment had transformed into a platform more powerful than anything Eleanor could have orchestrated deliberately. Dignity is not a privilege to be earned or granted, she continued, her voice gaining strength. It is the fundamental birthright of every human being. When we allow it to be violated for some, we weaken its protection for all. The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Among those standing and applauding was a representative from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security who had requested a meeting with Eleanor the following day to discuss policy reforms in airport security screening procedures. After the ceremony, at a reception in her honor, Eleanor finally had a moment alone with Ambassador Richardson. "Your speech was remarkable, Eleanor," he said, clasping her hand warmly. "You've transformed a terrible incident into something truly meaningful." "It shouldn't have taken public humiliation to create this opportunity," she replied candidly. "But since it happened, I'm determined to make it count." Richardson nodded. "The Secretary asked me to inform you that the State Department's review has been completed. Both agents have been terminated, and TSA is implementing new verification protocols and bias training nationwide." "That's a start," Eleanor acknowledged, "though I'm less interested in punishing individuals than changing systems." Speaking of changes, Richardson continued, "The settlement offer from the Port Authority has been increased substantially since you declined their non-disclosure agreement." Eleanor smiled slightly. "As my son informed them, any settlement funds will go directly to the foundation. This was never about money." Her phone chimed with a text from Terrence back in Minneapolis. The lawsuit against the airport authority had been settled that morning with a substantial compensation directed to funding scholarships for students from marginalized communities pursuing careers in international relations and humanitarian work. James Walker approached, looking distinctly more relaxed in Geneva than he had in the tense environment of JFK. Dr. Washington, the Foundation's legal advisory board, is set to meet next month. We've already received applications from over 40 attorneys interested in providing pro bono support." Eleanor nodded with satisfaction. "And the young woman from the airport? Were you able to contact her?" "Yes," Walker confirmed. "Zoe Williams. She's accepted your offer to join the Foundation's community outreach team. Her social media post about your experience has now been viewed over 20 million times." Eleanor reflected on how quickly life could change. Just a week ago, she had been a retired professor headed to receive recognition for her past work. Now, she stood at the helm of a new organization with international support, media attention, and a platform she had never sought but would use purposefully. Later that evening, as the reception wound down, Eleanor's phone rang. It was Aisha. "Eleanor, we just watched your speech online. Terrence can't stop beaming with pride," Aisha exclaimed. "How does it feel to become an overnight icon?" Eleanor laughed softly. "Hardly an icon, dear. Just a grandmother who refused to be silenced." Well, that grandmother is trending on every social platform. The university is talking about establishing a scholarship in your name, and 3 talk shows have called asking for interviews when you return. The attention was still uncomfortable for Eleanor, who had always preferred working behind the scenes. Yet she recognized the power of visibility in creating change. After ending the call, Eleanor stepped onto the balcony overlooking Lake Geneva. The lights of the city reflected on the water's surface, creating pathways of illumination across the darkness. It struck her as an apt metaphor for what had happened. Out of a dark experience, unexpected light had emerged. 1 week later, Eleanor found herself back at JFK Airport, this time for a very different kind of passage through its terminals. She had been invited to review the newly implemented security protocols and training procedures that had resulted from her experience. Director Phillips himself waited nervously to greet her at the special entrance arranged for her arrival. "Dr. Washington, thank you for agreeing to this review," he said, extending his hand with noticeably more respect than their previous interaction. "Your input is invaluable to our reform process." Eleanor accepted his handshake with gracious professionalism. "I appreciate the invitation, Director. Real change requires ongoing evaluation and adjustment." As they walked through the terminal, Eleanor noticed how differently staff responded to her presence. Some recognized her immediately, others had clearly been briefed about her visit, but all demonstrated a level of respect that stood in stark contrast to her treatment just 2 weeks earlier. When they passed the passport control area where her ordeal had begun, Eleanor paused. The young black airport employee she had noticed that day, Zoe Williams, was there now wearing a visitor badge indicating her new role with the International Dignity Initiative. "Miss Williams will be observing today's review as part of our Community Oversight Committee," Eleanor explained to Phillips, who nodded with the careful agreement of someone who no longer had the luxury of refusal. The most powerful moment came when they reached the secondary screening room where Eleanor had been detained. It had been repurposed as a training center with new signage reading dignity and verification protocols. Inside, TSA agents were receiving training from a diverse team of instructors. The curriculum visible on the screen included modules on verification before assumption, recognizing implicit bias, and maintaining dignity throughout security procedures. The new verification system connects directly to State Department databases, Phillips explained, pointing to a demonstration in progress. Agents are now required to verify documentation with issuing authorities before detention procedures can be initiated. Eleanor nodded, watching, as the instructor emphasized to the agents that their job was security through verification, not authority through intimidation, a distinction that would have made all the difference in her case. After completing the review and providing her recommendations, Eleanor prepared to depart for her flight back to Minneapolis. As she approached the security checkpoint, she noticed how the agents straightened when they recognized her. Dr. Washington, the agent checking IDs, greeted her professionally. "Thank you for your work with our training program. Your boarding pass and ID, please." Eleanor provided the requested documents, noting the careful correctness of the agent's procedure. Thorough, but respectful. As she moved through the security screening without incident, she reflected on how systems could change when properly motivated. At her gate, she found a message waiting on her phone, a video from Terrence showing news coverage of airport security reforms being implemented nationwide, with her case cited as the catalyst. The accompanying text read simply, "You did this, Mom." Eleanor smiled, thinking of how different this airport experience was from her last. The same physical space, the same institutional framework, yet transformed by accountability, awareness, and the simple insistence on human dignity. As she settled into her seat for the flight home, Eleanor opened her laptop to review applications for the Foundation's first educational initiative, a program to support students from underrepresented backgrounds pursuing careers in international diplomacy and humanitarian work. The flight attendant paused beside her seat. "Dr. Washington, the captain asked me to welcome you aboard personally. Your work has made a difference for many of us in the travel industry, too." Eleanor thanked her, touched by the gesture. Looking out the window as the plane took off, she watched JFK Airport recede below her. The sight of her humiliation had become the launching point for a new chapter in her lifelong work. Not just educating refugees in distant camps, but addressing the barriers to dignity that existed in her own country. The Eleanor Washington who departed from New York this time was fundamentally the same person who had arrived 3 weeks earlier. Determined, dignified, dedicated to making a difference. What had changed was not her, but the impact she could now have. Her original humanitarian award recognizing decades of work in refugee education now sat on her desk back home. Beside it would soon stand something equally meaningful: the first photograph of the International Dignity Initiative's inaugural class of scholars, young people who would carry forward her vision of a world where everyone's humanity was recognized, respected, and protected. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Eleanor closed her eyes, not in the anxious rest of someone recovering from trauma, but in the peaceful contemplation of someone who had transformed injustice into action, humiliation into purpose, and an ending into a powerful new beginning. Have you ever witnessed someone turn a negative experience into positive change, or have you done so yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories of resilience and transformation inspire us all. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to help spread awareness about the importance of dignity and respect in our public institutions. Thank you for joining us for this powerful story. And remember, one person's stand for justice can create ripples of change that transform entire systems. Until next time, may you both recognize dignity in others and have yours recognized in return. Eleanor Washington's story teaches us that dignity is not just a concept, but a fundamental right worth fighting for. When systems fail us through bias and discrimination, our response defines our legacy. Eleanor transformed her humiliation into a platform for change, showing that one person's refusal to be silenced can reshape entire institutions. True strength isn't about avoiding injustice, but about how we respond when faced with it. By choosing strategic action over bitter resentment, Eleanor created lasting impact that extended far beyond her personal vindication. This story reminds us that change requires both courage and strategy. Eleanor's academic mind helped her see beyond personal offense to recognize systemic patterns, while her humanitarian heart guided her toward solutions that would help others. Her experience demonstrates that sometimes our most painful moments can become our most powerful opportunities to create meaningful change in the world. Through dignity maintained in adversity and purpose found in pain, we can transform individual injustice into collective progress.